The Magnus Archives is a horror podcast anthology produced by the entertainment company Rusty Quill, with episodes written by Jonathan Sims and directed by Alexander J. Newell, both of whom are also actors that voice some of the characters in this podcast. So, the premise is simple. Jonathan Sims, who, as you've probably guessed, is played by the writer of the episodes, is a new archivist in the Magnus Institute, which is an institute that collects people's statements of supernatural or weird things. And John here is an interesting position because the archive's previous archivist, Gertrude, died in a mysterious manner, and she made his job harder because she left the archive in a really messy and unorganized manner. Or did she? Hi, this is Random Guy Reviews. I make reviews of books, movies, TV shows, and in this case, podcasts. Basically, any type of media that I consume, I give my subjective thoughts on it, I put some low effort editing above it, and I put it here so people can say how I'm wrong and how my opinions are bullshit. So, yeah, anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps, especially for a small channel like me. And yeah, now let's get back to the actual video. You already know the premise of the podcast, which I have to admit I wasn't the biggest fan when I first heard about it, and I will elaborate further on that later. To give you a bit of a background, this is not really my first horror podcast. I've listened to a significant part of Welcome to Night Vale, even though I still haven't finished it. And Welcome to Night Vale is another anthological horror podcast about really weird things that you might or might not consider as horror. But that's for another video, maybe if I actually finish listening to it once. But yeah, before getting into the good and the bad, a reminder that this review is about both the first and second seasons, because I'll be honest, mostly I don't remember which stuff is from which season, which I suppose is a bit of a negative, and I'll elaborate a bit after this, but yeah. As usual, I'm going to start first with the negatives, with the things that I don't particularly love, which in this case there aren't that many. And before I move on to the positive things, which there are many for this. And yeah, so first the negatives. The first one is the format of the podcast itself. Like I said earlier, I wasn't really a big fan when I heard about the premise. The premise is, if it wasn't clear, John, the archivist, he is trying to get audio recordings of the statements that are in the archives, basically. And yeah, so basically, John records his readings of those statements of horror or weirdness that people have. And yeah, when I first heard about it, I wasn't really the biggest fan of it. Even now, I still think it's a bit of a negative, but I don't think it's that big of a negative, so it doesn't really affect my enjoyment too much. It's just that sometimes this format means that some of the stories are awkwardly told. It's like people in reality would never say the things that are said in some of these statements. It reads more like normal prose you'd find in a novel instead of a statement, or supposedly a statement, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because the prose is really, really good. It just kind of breaks my suspension of disbelief sometimes, because I realize that this is not how people would write these statements. This is how an author would write it, which yeah, it's just a tiny bit negative. It's not really a big deal, like I said. And the second one is, yeah, the one that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it can be hard to remember details or connections that you can only notice if you remember exactly what was said like 20 episodes ago. For the record, I listen to about an episode or two a day, which means that this negative thing probably says more about my crappy memory than the podcast itself. So yeah, again, this isn't really a big problem as I can still follow the overarching plot quite well, I think, unless I'm missing something huge, which I might. It's just that sometimes I forget the details, which can be really annoying. But usually I can just go to the comment section of the podcast's YouTube videos. And yeah, that's how I kind of just refresh my memory and just look at what other people thinks about it and what other people also apparently forgot. And yeah, I think those are really the only negatives, which again, they are just small annoyances. Nothing, nothing that really affects my enjoyment as a whole. I mean, yeah, it barely matters. That's what I'm trying to say. And now for the good stuff. So yeah, My initial thought before I started was I was afraid that the anthology format might not be good or that it might make the whole thing boring. I was worried that the framing story, which is John the Archivist reading the statements, would get boring. And at first, that was what I thought. The statements themselves were fantastic. They were unique and always surprising and always scary, really. And but however, the framing story was, I don't know, it was not so interesting to me. However, as I kept listening to more and more episodes, this changed quickly as the overarching plot starts to form and starts to evolve, and the statements themselves start to affect John's own reading. So, yeah, it's like the statements, which I previously considered the main part of the story, and the framing story just melts together really well, slowly, and this really culminates in the end of season 2, and maybe season 1 as well, I think. Again, I don't remember exactly at what point season 1 ended, but yeah, there are moments where there is no statements anymore. It's just the framing story, except it's now really interesting because it's connected to the overarching plot, and yeah, I really enjoyed that. Another thing that I really like is how varied it is. One of the reasons why I never get bored by the podcast is every episode always brings something new, something different, either in the characters or in the settings, just in the scary stuff in general. Yes, sometimes there are recurring motives, but those adds to the interconnectedness and the overarching story arc, so I don't really mind it. It's actually good to have a motive like that. It rewards listeners who remember stuff. And maybe if it's just varied, then I wouldn't be so impressed. But yeah, the thing is, they're not just varied, they are also immersive too. I don't know how much they had to do research for every episode, but considering how all of them feel real, well, I can't say for sure since most of these things are things that I've never experienced, but to me they feel real. They must put a lot of research, I'm guessing. There is this sense of, what's the word? Verisimilitude? Is that how you even pronounce it? I don't know. That holds everything together basically. So it's not just varied, but most of these very varied stories feel like they could be real, they could be happening, and yeah, that's really the thing that I think separates this podcast from a lot of others is that it feels real. And finally, I think the episodes are just also well made. The production value is just insane. All of the acting or casting and the sound effects and the spooky music that adds so much without being intrusive, which I think is really a hard balance to strike. Yeah, it all just adds up to this really engaging experience that I feel like I won't get tired of as long as the writing quality stays high. And until now, I don't really have any reason to believe that it won't stay this high. So, yeah. Overall, I don't really have much bad things to say about it, and the ones that I do have are just minor annoyances. So I recommend this to basically everyone looking to listen to a podcast. Either just a new podcast or a new horror podcast, or even for anyone who's trying to find their first podcast if you're into horror, I suppose. Yeah, I think it's just that good. 2 seasons in, and the subject matter that are discussed are things that a lot of people are interested in or scared of, I guess, because of the variation that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, definitely recommend it. Though you might want to check some of the content warning for the episodes, because some can go like quite far into the horror stuff, and you might not be prepared if you have some sort of phobias of the things that is being depicted. But yeah, so far it's 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I can't wait to delve deeper into season 3. And I will also make a review of that once I'm done, obviously. But yeah, thanks for watching, and please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and tell me what you think about it. I'm curious to see what people think about this podcast. And yeah, bye.